Okay, anything you have to say about in who sponsorship, any one of those great things I need to refer to? You know, it's very fine print. That's it. Good morning, everyone. We would like to thank the Tilson family for sponsoring the annual Talmud Torah. It's a schus for Besaros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Amen. That'd be nice. You got that? Okay. So what we had. What we had yesterday. So a brief reminder. One of the statements we make in the morning, Yud Gimel Midos Shatorah Nidreshes Bohem, is what Rabbi Shmuel tells us. Davar Shahaya B'chlal. The Yotza B'chlal L'lamed, Lo L'lamed Al Atzma Yotza, Elo L'lamed Al Kol HaKlal Kula Yotza. In other words, for example, the Torah is warning us that when it comes to Avodah Zarah, and the Torah warns us that to go ahead and slaughter an animal for Avodah Zarah Zvicha is obviously a violation of the Torah because you are worshiping that Avodah Zarah. Now, what happens if that specific force or deity or that Avodah Zarah is not worshipped by slaughtering animals, right? They're very ethical. They only take tofu. They don't like meat, that Avodah Zarah. So what happens? In other words, if I go ahead somewhere on the West Coast and find an Avodah Zarah, and the person decides to shecht an animal, but that's not how it's worshipped in that society, is it still a violation? So obviously, if you go ahead and perform an act that's part of the rules and regulations of that Avodah Zarah, that is how you worship that force, clearly we understand that that's a violation. But what happens if it's zvicha, to slaughter for such an Avodah Zarah? So the Torah tells us, listen, lo sizbach, don't do it, even if it's not the way that force is worshipped. Okay, now, what's interesting is that when the Torah warns us not to go out and slaughter, it doesn't just include slaughtering, but it includes any type of service that is performed inside the Beis HaMikdash. So Zvicha, Kabbalah, receiving the blood, Holacha, Zrika, any one of the four services that are done inside of the Beis HaMikdash are included in that warning that if you perform it to any pagan deity, even if it's not the routine, you violate the Torah prohibition. And it's working. In other words, the Torah only mentions one. So how do we include four? It was Haya B'chlal, right? Yotza Min HaKlal L'lamed. It teaches not just for itself, but it teaches for the rule of all four services done in the Beis HaMikdash. Fine. But then we had this question that we have to deal with, and we have to remember, we must remember as we start our daf, what Rava bar Rav Chanan is going to ask Abaye, wait a second. The Torah tells us, Lo sishtachaveh. You should not go ahead and bow to a pagan service. So wait a second. Maybe that is to include, maybe that is that type of statement that is lelamed, to teach on many more things. And maybe what the Torah is teaching us is that if I do anything that's honorable to a pagan force, to an Avodah Zarah, even if it is not the way that specific Avodah Zarah is worshipped, and even if it's not done in the Beis HaMikdash, maybe the Torah is warning us such a thing is a violation. So maybe the hishtachava is the issue. And we wonder, wait a second. Okay, it's an interesting question, Rav bar Rav Chanan. But if so, why does the Torah mention zvicha at all? So what we had in the bottom of Samach Amud Beis, and now in the beginning of Samach Aleph, is that perhaps, and that's what we are told, what we are being taught here is mechashvin me'avoda le'avoda. In other words, we find by Kotshim that there's such a thing called machshavas pigul. So in a couple of years, we get to Zvachim, and one of the sugyas we're going to discuss is the fact that you have to be very sure when you perform any of the services in the Beis HaMikdash that your mind has to be operating with an understanding that everything will be done correctly. And if I go ahead and shecht an animal, and I have intention to go ahead, and I'm doing it with intention to perform a later service of it, for example, eating the meat, or in some or sprinkling the blood, with doing it in an improper way that it should not be consumed by those who are designated to consume it, or to sprinkle the blood outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So there are the sugyas we're going to be discussing in the future year are known as the sugyas of machsheves pigul, okay, a thought that's inappropriate. Now, what we're going to be discussing here, so let's start off with the last line and a half of Samach Hamud Beis, hashochet behema, if let's say a person slaughters an animal, lizrok damo la'avodas kochavim, so now we're going to be applying those concepts of machashvin ma'avoda la'avoda, which means I perform one act with intention to have the damaging effect with a future, with a service that is going to be coming in the next stage. Okay, so the discussion here, hashochet behema lizrok damo la'avodas kochavim. In other words, my shechita is not with the intention that I'm doing it for an avodah zarah, but I do have in mind as when I shecht that the sprinkling or the haktorah or the offering of the limbs should be done for an avodah zarah. Okay, hashochet behema lizrok damo la'avodas kochavim, lahaktir chelva, to offer it the fats for avodas kochavim. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Asura, that too is considered a violation, and Rish Lakish top of Samach Aleph Omar Muteres. And what the Gemara discussed is the fact that could be. So again, we're going with what Rava Baruch Hanan is telling us, that perhaps Ishtachava is to teach us that any honorable service is included in the warning, even if that specific avodah zarah is not worshipped in that way. And if we work with that approach, we ask, but wait a second. What is the word? What is the teaching of Lo Sisbach teach us? Maybe Lo Sisbach is to teach us that what? That mechashvin ma'avoda la'avoda, that even if I do not have an intention to be avodah avodah zarah with the shechita, but when I shecht, I have in mind to perform either the zrika or the haktorah, that too is included in the warning. So the Gemara tells us, Hanicha, everything will work out well according to Rabbi Yochanan, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, where by kachim we know that mechashvin ma'avoda la'avoda, so you don't need a verse when it comes to avodah zarah to warn us, because if by Kachim, if in the Beis Hamikdash, the concept of mechashvin me'avoda le'avoda is effective, so obviously it would apply on the dark side in avodah zarah. Ela l'Rish Lakish, but according to l'Rish Lakish, that when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash, it's not really a violation when I perform one act with intention of doing something wrong in a future act. So maybe the word zvicha by avodah zarah is to teach you that mechashvin le'avoda le'avoda and baikra, and you need a verse. Now, what the Gemara is going to now claim, maskif Rav Papa. Rav says, Rav Papa tells us, the truth is, you got it wrong, Rav Papa claims. Because Rav Papa is going to tell us, Rav Yochanan lo ba'ikra. You're telling me that for Rav Yochanan, I don't need the verse because I can learn it from Kachim, from how the service is done in the Beis Hamikdash. But that's not so. Ad kan lo ka'asa Rabbi Yochanan, because when Rabbi Yochanan tells us in the Beis Hamikdash, a thought by shechita could be effective, right, even if it relates to a future service, Rabbi Yochanan is only telling us that the animal becomes prohibited. Ela behema. Aval gavra, but he's not talking about the person. Lav, loy bar katlahu, he doesn't get the death penalty. In other words, don't tell me that for Rabbi Yochanan, right, everything is clear because according to Rabbi Yochanan, I can learn it from Kachim. That's not true, because in Kachim it's talking about the animal. By Avodah Zarah, what are we talking about? The person, okay? So we do need the verse l'chiyuv v'gavra to state that the person who goes ahead and performs performs avodah zarah with a machshava from one service to another service, that he deserves the death penalty. And so too the question could be asked the other way around. Maskif le'ravacha bred ravika. And according to Rish Lakish mi baikra, you told me that, well, for Rish Lakish we might need the verse, but that's actually not so, because at kan l'kashar Rish Lakish, even though by kochim, Rish Lakish holds that a machshava from avoda to avoda is not effective. Rish Lakish only talked about the behema, about the animal. Aval Gavra, but he would agree that a Gavra bar katlahu. And if you ask, wait a second, how is it possible that Rish Lakish is of the opinion that when it comes to avodah zarah, that if I have one a thought which during shechita for something in the future, that the person deserves the death penalty, but that item that the service took place regarding is permissible. Is that possible? Do we ever find such a thing? That a person doesn't have avodah zarah, the person deserves the death penalty, but the object itself is not prohibited. Do you find that? Well, we do actually. If a person bows to a mountain, what do we learn? Velo Eloheihem, that we are told in Eretz Yisrael that all the pagan nations would bow to mountains, and the Gemara darshans that although, right, if the avodah zarah was placed on a mountain, by bowing to it, you prohibit that item, but velo harim Elohehem, that if you go out and worship a mountain because it's connected to the ground, they don't have the ability to prohibit it. So if a person bows to a specific mountain, he himself violates the prohibition of avodah zarah and gets the death penalty, but the mountain itself remains permissible. So what do you see? That it is possible that you could have a situation that the person himself gets the death penalty, even the item is mutter. So when Rish Lakish says that when you have one machshava, or you have a machshava during shechita for something in the future, that doesn't mean that the person does not get the death penalty. Perhaps he does. And when he said mutter, he's talking about the item. So therefore, midid dehava mishtacha velahar, har mutar va'avda gets the saif. Obviously, if it's a goy, it's a saif. So that's what we are told. Here we go. Do you remember Rava bar Rav Chanan? So Rava bar Rav Chanan had a question. His question was, well, perhaps when the Torah tells us lo sishtachaveh, it is to teach us that any honorable act performed to an avodah zarah, any honorable act, even if that specific avodah zarah is not worshipped that way, that's considered a violation. That's what Rava bar Rav Chanan believed or claimed. So it says, Ravacha medifti leravina, wait a second. Lemaide ka'amar, based on what this Rava bar Rav Chanan tells us, Lemaide ka'amar Rava bar Rav Chanan to Abaye. And what did he say to him? The Gemara is going to remind us, Eima yotze ishtachava, maybe ishtachava is lelamed ala klal kulo, that maybe ishtachava is to teach us regarding all service. Well, there's a problem. Because the Torah tells us that when you get to Eretz Yisrael, don't do too much research into pagan practices, and don't start asking Eicha Ya'avdu, how are these pagan nations worshiping their gods? Ve'eseken gam ani, and I should do so as well. And obviously, by the Torah telling us that, you should know, it's a major problem if you start researching how those pagans are worshiping their gods. You know what the Torah is telling us? That the way they worship the avodah zarah, that is where there's an issue. So if, for example, a specific avodah zarah, as we know, peor, the way you worship it is by defecating, so therefore that is how you violate the prohibition of peor. If you go ahead and want to worship Laleinu, a person wants to worship Marculus, right? They would worship the Mercury. So the way it was done is what? By throwing stones. So obviously the Torah is telling us that the way you violate the prohibition is performing specifically the acts that were designated by that cult, right? By those of the Avodah Zarah. Now, if you claim, like Rava bar Rav Chanan, that any act is included, why does the Torah have to tell us that? Because if the Torah is telling us, according to him, that ishtachava, anything you perform, anything you do is avodah zarah, because ishtachava yotza min haklal lelamed ala klal kulo yotza. So why does the Torah have to warn us specifically that be sure not to perform an act the way they worship their avodah zarah? L'meutamai. Okay, well, v'chiteiman, if you're going to claim Lemu'ute, that it's here to exclude hapoer atzmo lezavchim. Then imagine you have a more normal, mainstream avodah zarah, that they slaughter animals to worship that force, and you go ahead and say, you know what, I'm going to worship it, and I'm going to take the practice from peor and defecate in front of it. And maybe the Torah is telling us that that's not considered a violation, because defecating is a very odd way of honoring a deity. So therefore, the Torah is telling us that's not included because it has to be hashtachavo, which is honorable. But mishtachavo nafka, ma'ishtachavo derech kibud, afkol derech kibud. In other words, if you look at ishtachavo on itself, ishtachavo teaches us that. In other words, you can't tell me that ishtachavo is yotzam and aklal lilamed, it's coming to go ahead and teach, and therefore it's coming to tell you that any form of service. Well, ishtachavo on its own teaches you that. In other words, without thinking like Rabbi Bar Chanan. So Torah tells us, you know what it could be? Ela lemeute hapo. In other words, imagine you have an avodah zarah that the way it's worshipped is not in an honorable way. Like we mentioned, Marculus. Marculus was worshipped by throwing stones. So one would claim, wait a second, since that cult, since those of the avodah zarah worship it in a way that's not honorable, so any way that's not honorable is included. So therefore, perhaps what the Torah is telling us that salkadai tachmina, I would have thought, hoil va'avodah bizoyon, since the nature of that avodah zarah is worshipped in a shameful way, af kol bizoyon, so perhaps any bizoyon. In other words, if Marculus is worshipped, right, by throwing stones, so anything that's a degrading act will be included. Therefore, kamash malon, therefore it's needed. Okay, here we go. Ella. Now comes the following question. Had Omer Rabbi Lozer. Rabbi Lozer tells us, minayin, how do we know? Lezoveach behemo lemarculus. So again, Marculus. If you in Spanish, Wednesday, right, is a Merculus, right, Mercury. So obviously it has its roots, right? It has its roots in these pagan culture, and even Wednesday itself. Well, Wednesday seems like some Nordic word that became part of the way we identify days. But let's go back to Marculus. Hazoveach behemel Marculus. So Marculus, generally, the rules and regulations were that if you want to go ahead and worship it, you throw stones. A person decides, no, I'm going to be better than them. I'm going to go ahead and offer an animal. So we are told, says Rabbi Lozer, how do you know that he's chayev? How do you know he's chayiv? Shenemar v'lo yizbechu od zivcheyam l'seirim. The Torah warns us among the many warnings of avodah zarah that it seems to be that the way they would worship the devil are related to goats, and that's found in other cultures as well. And the Torah warns us that you should never, keep yourself away from many practices, among them drinking blood, because by doing so you might one day be offering zivcheyam l'seirim. Okay, so but listen carefully to the language. Velo yizbechu. The Torah warns us, don't go ahead and do a zvicha, a shchita, a slaughtering. And what Rabbi Lozer tells us is the following. Im eino inyan lekedarka. In other words, obviously, I don't need a pasuk to tell me that if you have an avodah zarah that is, the norm is to shecht animals to it. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that that's prohibited, because that's the norm. Dechsiv, because, and how do I know that I don't need a verse that if it is the norm, that the Torah warns us not to do it? Because dechsiv, eicho ya'avdu, because the Torah tells us that if you go ahead and research the way they do it, and then you perform it, obviously it's a violation. So what is the lo yizbechu to teach you? Teneu inyan l'shaloi kedarko. The Torah is warning you that even if it's not the norm, meaning, even if that's not the way they worship, still now, but the problem is, Rabbi Lozer, if you're telling me that word v'lo yizbechu is to teach us that even if it's not the norm, it's included in avodah zarah, but according to Rabbi Bar Chanan, l'shelo kedarko mishtachavo nafka. Again, Rabbi Bar Chanan claims that the word ishtachavo teaches us that even if it's not the norm, it's included. So, how do we understand this need of Rabbi Lozer if Rava Bar Chanan is correct? So the Gemara answers an interesting answer here, that Hossam, that the warning there v'lo yizbechu, that we are told you should not do to any avodah zarah, even if it's not the norm, bizoveach lahachi. So it seems to be that someone is upset at some pagan force, and therefore they decide to worship it in an unusual way. or by slaughtering it, even that is unusual for that avodah zarah, comes Rav Elazar and he tells us, don't do it. I knew someone in Toronto that as a child after the war, he was hid in France in some monastery, and he was able to observe how they interacted with whatever little idols they basically had. And he mentioned that one time it wasn't raining for a couple of weeks, and they got upset at one of the statues, and they turned her around to face the wall as a punishment for not bringing rain. So it seems to be that there is such a thing as getting angry with your avodah zarah, and you're fuming at it. You want to break it because you don't want to, mess up things for the future. But they would punish it. So maybe this is what we are talking about. Bizoveach lahachis. That there was some form of anger towards this avodah zarah, and that's why the Torah is telling us that even though your agenda is to show that you are angry, but nevertheless, when it comes to zvicha, it's a chashuv, a significant avodah, and it is included. Okay, here comes a story. So now we can start something that's a little bit linear. So here we go. So here's the story. Rav Hamnuna. Okay, so we're going to be dealing with a questionnaire that has something like 5 or 6 answers. An interesting question where there's going to appear to be a contradiction between our Mishnah and a Mishnah later on in a couple daf. And the main issue, a little bit of a preview here, is the following. We all understand your avodah zarah, terrible thing, terrible punishment. What if a person makes a statement, I'm planning to be avodah zarah? Just making a statement. Is that a violation or not? Just making a statement. And we're going to analyze one Mishnah which would seem to indicate, well, if you just make a statement, no big deal. But the Mishnah later on, Samach Zayin, Samach Ches, seems to indicate that even a statement is already a violation. So how are we going to deal with it? So it's a contradiction. So we're going to have Rav Amnuna, Rav Yosef, Abaye, Ravina, Rav Ashi, Rava, all the great Amoraim addressing the issues. But it starts off with an interesting story that Rav Amnuna, Irkisu Leituri. So Nebuch, his oxen went wild and they were lost. So what does the great Rav Amnuna do? He goes looking for his oxen. So Pogabe Rava, so as he's making his rounds, who does he meet? He meets Rava. So Rabbi asks him a question. Rabbi asks Rav Amnuna, Masnisna Dode. Let's analyze these two Mishnayos, and there seems to be a contradiction. Maybe the Gemara is telling us that, when you lose something, your mind is occupied. It seems to be that these great people, even when their mind was occupied looking for their keys before they had a little Apple tag, right? They were still able to be involved in Limud Torah. Tzanan, here we go. Ready for the contradiction? Our Mishnah says, Ha'oved avodas kochavim. Okay? What's the violation? Oved. Oved in. If you actually worship the avodah zarah. Omer, if he says I'm planning to, not lo. So our Mishnah seems to say in Amira, just a statement, not an issue. But look at the Mishnah later on. Now look at the later Mishnah. Ha-omer, if a person says, Evod, I'm planning to worship an avodah zarah. Elech ve'evod, I'm planning to go and do it. Neilech ve'navod, or if I go with a group. And all that is included in the violation, just the statement. Statement, yes, a problem, not a problem. So Ramuna says, Omar le, listen, the way I understand our Mishnah, that there's no violation with just a statement, Be'omer einoi eini mikablo olai ela ba'avoda. In other words, when is it that a statement is not an issue, or the statement is not the violation? Obviously it's a vizarai, obviously it's prohibited, but when is it that a statement on its own is not one that is worthy of a death penalty? When I clarify that I'm not planning to complete that service until I actually do it, okay? That's how Rav Amnuna understands it. Rav Yosef Omar, come on. Rav Yosef claims, Tanoi shoklas ma'alma. In other words, it's machlokes tanoim. I'm going to go through the Mishnayos and prove to you that there are two schools. Okay? Tanoi de Tanya. Where's the machlokes tanoim? Haomer bo vavduni. So we're talking about a person who gets up and says, "Come worship me." Come worship me. I mean, throughout history, people have been worshipped. Humans have been worshipped. So if a person gets up and says, "Come worship me," Ramer Mechayev. Okay, that's it. You basically declared an avodah zarah. You made a statement. Chayev. Seems to be Rav Meir's of the opinion that the statement itself creates an issue. Rav Yudah says potter. Okay, now, if people actually worship this individual, kula alma loy pligi, there's no dispute. pesel. And the way we learned, what we read yesterday, lo yisaseh lecho, don't make yourself into an idol, right? Don't make a human being into a god. It's something that we have to be very careful within our culture, where we, Baruch Hashem, are taught to respect great rabbinic leaders, but we have to always be careful not to cross that line to go ahead and worship a human being, because the Torah tells us, lo yisaseh lecho, don't make a human into a pesel. So again, Rameir and Rav Yehuda don't disagree. When it comes to actually worshiping a human being, we have a major problem. But it seems to be that if I just said bo'u ve'avduni, Rameir holds amira mechayev. Rav Yehuda says potter. So therefore, Rav Yosef is claiming that the contradiction between the two Mishnayos, where one seems to indicate an amira is not yet in avodah zarah, and the second one, which seems to indicate an amira is avodah zarah, it's machlokas tanoim. Okay. Now, ki pligi. So where's the dispute? B'dibura ba'alma, just with speech. Rav Meir sova dibura mil sohi. Rav Meir holds, yeah, speech is an issue. And Rav Yehuda sovar dibura lav mil sohi. So Rav Yosef tells us this is how we solve the problem. We have the Rav Amnuna approach, we have Rav Yosef approach, but who's going to go ahead and challenge Rav Yosef's opinion? Rav Yosef himself. And he's going to say, no. Hadar Omar Rav Yosef lav mil sohi de omri. What I said is just simply not a fact. Why? De'afilu le Rav Yehuda, I have no doubt that even Rav Yehuda agrees that in general, dibura nami chiyuv mechayev, that Rav Yehuda is of the opinion that even with speech only, a person is chayev. The Tani Rav Yehuda oimer la'oilom eino chayev, because when it comes to a mesis, when it comes to someone that is encouraging others and inspiring others to worship some kind of a pagan force, avodah zorah, achiyomar evod elech ve'evod nelech v'navod. In other words, Rav Yehuda is in agreement that speech could be a complete violation. Okay? So therefore my answer is no good. Now, and if you ask, wait a second, so what is their dispute? Rabbi and Rav Yehuda do disagree about a person getting up and saying, worship me. And Rav Yehuda seems to say that it is not yet a violation. Well, there it's unique because it's a person. When someone is inspiring others not to worship some kind of distant deity or force or avodah zarah, but rather when a person is trying to inspire others to worship himself. Now, what did people say? V'amrilei, right? A person gets up, Rabbi say, right? I'm a higher entity, please worship me. And everyone says, yeah. How do you understand the in? Va'amrilei in. And there is a dispute kamiflige. Mar sovar, opinion number one is mesis la'atzma, shmili. That they tune in the ka'amrilei kushto. In other words, it's a yes. And that's the problem, that as soon as they say yes, it's a commitment and it's an avodah zarah, because everyone agrees that speech is an issue. But why would someone say that? Perhaps not. Umar Sovar, on the other hand, Rav Yehuda holds, Mesis la'atzma lo shmi'aleh. People don't tune in. When a person gets up and says, worship me, what do they say? Yeah, sure. Go get five in, go fly a kite. Who are you? Because Meimar Amri, what people say, human nature is, Maishna ihu minan. In what way is he different than me? He's a human, I'm a human, right? Why should I worship him? Maishna ihu, Amud Beis, minan didon. So why did they say yes? Ve'in de ka'amri, the answer is, achuchi alei. And they say, sure. We're going to worship you. Right? That's what they're basically saying. So therefore, Rav Yehuda holds, in other words, Rav Yehuda in general holds that when it comes to speech, a statement that I'm going to worship avodah zarah, it is included. There, regarding a person, is different because they're thinking to themselves, he's a nut. You worship a human, I'm a human as well. In the ka'amri achuchi alei, they're laughing at him. So how do we deal with our Mishnah? Bottom line is, Rav Yosef just got rid of his own answer. We still have a contradiction. We had Rav Amnuna's approach. What about Rav Yosef? Umasnisin, there's a difference. So here we go. Kan biyochid hanises, kan berabim hanisosim. So the chiluk, the difference that's going to be presented now is the difference between individuals being approached and multitudes. What's the difference? So we say the following. Yochid, if one individual is approached and says, he develops a relationship with this guru, and he tells him to go ahead and worship some force, once he says, I'm going to do it, human nature is lamimlech. He's not going to back off. V'toy basrei. And therefore, even speech itself is a violation. But Rabbi, when it's a group, we assume that among them, one of them is going to start questioning it, and therefore Rabbi, even with a statement of a commitment, it's not yet an avodah zarah, mimleche, because they're going to start asking one another, wait a second, well, what does this guy want? Is he normal, right? Does anyone know if he knows what he's talking about? So therefore, odds are, mimlechi, they're going to rethink it, the loto basrei, and therefore, that's where Rav Yosef, that's how we have an answer to deal with the contradiction between the two Mishnayos. Now, Rav Yosef has proof for it. I'm Rav Yosef, mino aminalo, I can prove it. Dechsiv. Look at the language of the Torah. It's all in the singular. Lo yisava lo v'lo yisishma elov ha'ava v'shama chayev. In other words, it's in the singular. That by just listening, yeah, but it's in the singular. If it's a group, the whole system is different. So if Rav Yosef says someone who's going to question him, obviously it's Abaye, Eisvei Abaye. Mishani, is there really a difference? Benises de Rabim, Lenises de Yochid, is there really a difference between a group that gets inspired by someone else or the individual? Vatanya, look at this, look at the Brisa. Ki yesisecha achicha, beni mecha, echad Yochid anises, ve'echad Rabim anisosim. The Brisa says there's no difference. So, the Brisa tells us there's no difference between the individual and the masses. Now, there are differences between a Yochid who's Ovid Avodah Zarah and a group which we call the Irani Dacha. There are differences, and that's going to be spelled out now. But when it comes to a commitment, he does not agree with Rav Yosef's outlook that the difference, that speech is an issue only towards an individual, but towards the masses. There's no such source for it, argues Abaye. Now, the difference between Yochid and Rabim is, V'hoitzi akosuv Yochid mechlal Rabim, yeah, there are rules that relate specifically to the individual. The Rabbi Mechlal Yochanan, there are laws that relate specifically to the masses and not to the individual. And what are they? Yochid Mechlal Rabim lahachmir al gufo. He gets a more severe punishment, right? He gets the skila. And v'lahakal al mamona, because when the individual is avodah zarah, yes, you kill him, but nevertheless, when it comes to the property, it's not destroyed. But on the other hand, the irani dachas, it gets a less severe punishment of saif. But what happens to all the property in the irani dachas? The city is destroyed. Rabbi Mechlal Yochid lahakal al gufam. Yeah, the punishment is not as severe, but lahachmer al mamonim. So comes out, says Abaye. Look at this brayso. Baha milsa. It is only regarding that which is spelled out, the shani, that there's a difference. Aval bechol mili. When it comes to everything else, ki adodeninu. They are the same. So, Rav Yosef, your answer to deal with these Mishnayos simply doesn't work. Ela Omar Abaye. Abaye's turn to tell us how to deal with the contradiction. Kan benises mepi atzmo, kan benises mepi acherim. So Abaye is going to offer that the difference is between someone that is inspired by himself or by others. He explains, mepi atzma, if a person, people have often within their head back and forth. Therefore, mepi atzma, if he himself is inspired, says, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and worship. I hear that it works. I saw online that people, their life was changed by traveling to the Far East. I'm going to go ahead and go to Thailand and be inspired. Mepi atzma, mimlach, he can change his mind. People have back and forth. Mepi acherim, human nature is such that if others are the ones that say, no, make your way there, the speech itself locks it in. Gorir basrayu. So here's Abaye's suggestion. The difference is not like Rav Amnuna, not like Rav Yosef, but rather it depends on what was the impetus, what started the process. If it comes from a person himself, speech is nothing, you change your mind. When it's from others, unfortunately, it locks it in. Omar Abaye mino amino, I can prove it tachsiv. Lo sa'ove lo, velo sishma elov. Okay, ha'ava v'shama, to another person, chayiv. The language is quite simple in the Torah. Torah warns us, don't tune into that person and don't hear his words. His words already are a violation. When are the words a violation? If it comes from someone else. That's Abaye's approach. Next, who else is going to deal with the contradiction between these two Mishnayos? Next authority is obviously Rava. Rava Amar na. Aidi va'aidi ben nisas mepi acherim. Both cases, right? Our Mishnah that seems to indicate that you actually have to worship. The Mishnah later on, which seems to say that speech itself is already a violation, are both dealing when others, right, put you on that track. So what's the difference? Why is it in one case speech already? So the idea is like this. It seems to be that when someone would be encouraged by someone else to be over Avodah Zarah, sometimes you just get a general statement. Yeah, let's go worship, that force. And sometimes you get specifics. Let me tell you about that amazing Avodah Zarah, right? It'll take us a couple weeks to get there, but there's a very unique way, the way it's served, and the blessings you receive. In other words, when you get the details, you know what happens when you start getting the details? You're locked in. So here we go. This is what Rabbi says. Hodo marlei kach oicheles, kach shosa, kach metiva, kach merio. When you get all the details of what that incredible Avodah Zarah does, so then speech itself locks it in, and therefore the Mishnah later on tells us that just with the commitment, it's already a violation. Our Mishnah deloi omarlei, where those words and the details were not presented. So that's Rava's explanation, that if there's detail, word itself already locks it in. Rava has to bring proof too. Omar Rava mina aminala dichsev me'elohei ha'amim asher svivosechem hakrovim elecha arachokim. Now, when the Torah warns us not, over and over again in the Torah, right? It seems to be Avodah Zarah was this unbearable driving force. And the Torah as warns us that be very careful not to be enticed by the nations that are near you, hakrovim or rachokim. Now obviously questions, what does the Torah have to spell out? Krovim, rachokim, just say don't worship Avodah Zarah. So it's a well-known statement that metivan shel krovim atalomed al rachokim. In other words, usually when someone wants to inspire you to be a oived Avodah Zarah, the norm would be they would talk about some pagan force, some kind of a cult that's thousands of miles away. It takes weeks to get there, and they tell you these incredible stories and legends that they hear. Now, they're not going to go ahead and tell you about what your neighbor worships. You know why? Because you know that what your neighbor worships is a complete waste of time. That you see that his life is a disaster, and that he's been turning to that idol for 45 years and nothing good have ever occurred. So what do? They always want to inspire you with the rechokim, with those things that are very, very far. Okay? And the Torah tell us, you know what? You could figure out it's all baloney. Look at the krovim, and then you'll figure out about the rechokim, right? Look at those things that are near you. You see that they're good for nothing. The same will be regarding those legends from afar. Me Eloheinu amim asher sivosechem hakrovim alecha mali krovim mali rechokim. And the Gemara asks, why does the Torah have to spell out the krovim, the ones that are near you, rechokim, the ones that are far? Hochi kamar. This is what the Torah is telling us. Metivuson shel krovim, from the quote unquote, from the goodness of those of your neighbor. Atalomed mativoson shel rechokim. You could figure out those that are far away. In other words, just as you know the one right next to your neighbor, you know what he buys for it every day, right? You know how much he relies on it. You know every detail regarding what your neighbor does, and you know that it's worth, completely nothing. So too the rechokim. So what do you see from it? That the violation of Avodah Zarah that's being spoken here about, it's with details. You know all the details of what your neighbor does, okay? My love, the omarle, obviously, kach oicheles. In other words, you know about your neighbor, you know what he's buying for his Avodah Zarah, kach shoisa, kach metiva, so it does good, kach meria. Shma mino, so for Rava, that is proof that the Avodah Zarah that's being discussed, where we are told that speech itself is an issue, what are we talking about? Where you know the details. Okay. Who's next? Ravashi Omar. Ravashi says the following, that if it's a person who's a newcomer to Avodah Zarah and he says, I'm going to start worshiping Avodah Zarah, speech is nothing. But if he already has a record, if he's done it already in the past, so when he says, I'm going to do so, he's nebach, an addict. So therefore, Ravashi Omar, Seifa b'Yisrael mumar. He's done it. Once he's done it and he says, I'm planning to do it, odds are he's going to do it, and even the speech is a violation. The last answer, Ravina Omar, Loizu Avzuktoni. Ravina says, listen, it's the structure sometimes that Mishnayos start off with giving us general information if you do it. And then Mishnah 2 says, and by the way, not just if you actually perform Avodah Zarah, but even if you only commit by speech, that too is a violation. So Ravina gives us the most basic upshot. So therefore, bottom line is we have Rav Amnuna, Rav Yosef, Abaye, Rava, Ravashi, and Ravina all dealing with this question. Okay, now, Next discussion, which was going to tie in a little bit, believe it or not, into Purim. Okay, Itmar. A person, has to go ahead, worship of an avodah zarah, not because he believes in it, but rather, he has a love towards someone and he goes ahead and acts as if he is worshiping, right? Or he does it meira, he fears, and this is probably more common throughout history, that they have no choice, right? They're living in Spain in the 15th century, they have to go ahead and worship some form for a Jew of an avodah zarah, meira. Is that a violation? Is that one that they would get the death penalty? Right? Obviously not a good thing. Abaye Omar Chayiv, he says that's full of avodah zarah. Ahava yira, even though you're not really committing yourself and you don't really believe in it, it's a violation. Rav Omar Potter. Abaye Omar Chayiv da polcha. You worshipped it. Bottom line is, look to act. He worshipped, he bowed to it, he defecated to Peor, he threw the stone to Marcules, he slaughtered the animal to whatever it is. Rav Omar Potter, come on. If he accepted it in his heart as a deity, then Eloi. Okay? So that's Machlokes Abaye Chayiv. Rava says Potter. Okay, so here we go. Omar Abaye mino minalo. Abaye says, I could prove this to you. Ditznan ha'oived avoidas kochavim. Remember our Mishnah? The Mishnah started saying echad ha'oived. Now, the language of the Mishnah started off with ha'oived avoidas kochavim, oved, and then it gave details. And when we already dealt earlier with the question, what is ha'oved? What is ha'oved if the details are given later? So Abaye wants to suggest that perhaps, my love, you know what it's teaching us? Echad ha'oved, that first we introduce a case of someone that worships the force, me'ahava, due to some external love, or me'ira. So therefore, that's how he analyzes the extra word of our Mishnah, ha'oved avodas kachavim. And then it says, echad ha'oved, why give the, in other words, the ha'oved that stands on its own, according to Abaye, is to teach you that even if it's me'ahava, me'ira, that too is included in the complete violation. What would Rava say? Rav Yomi already answered that what Ha'oved is telling us is that you should know, regarding that it's done in how it's done. In other words, if it's darka bekach, in other words, if they have some odd practice that's how you worship it, so if you perform that odd practice, even if it's not shchita, even if it's not kabbalas dam, even if it's not halach, even if it's not zrika, even if it's something that's very foreign, if that's how they worship it, you violate avodah zarah. That's how Rav Yirmiyah saw the word a daf ago regarding Ha'oved, and that's why Rava says your proof Abaye is not really solid proof that ahava and yira is included, because that word ha'oved is specifically relating to teach you the idea that if that cult worships in a specific way, you violate avodah zarah by doing so. Now Abaye is not over yet. Amar Abaye mina lo detanya. Lo sishtachave lohem. Okay, so the Torah warns us, we read this yesterday, not to go ahead and bow to an avodah zarah. So we are told, lohem let's not bow to avodah zarah. In other words, if you live in a society where you bow to people, right? You bow to people. I mean, we give shalom aleichem, we shake a hand. Recently, more we give the fist or whatever it is. Every culture has their way of interacting with the foreign human. If you live somewhere where bowing to people was the norm to show honor, it's not obviously a violation of avodah zarah. However, do some research before you bow to a person, because you might think that this green light to bow to a person applies even to someone that is worshipped like Haman. Talmud loymar velosa of them. So when we were little children, we were taught that the reason Mordechai would not bow to Haman was that he had a cross, which creates some difficulty that he had a cross of a Jewish boy that was going to be born a few hundred years later. But the Medrash does say that Haman did have an avodah zarah on him. That's the Medrash. The Gemara seems to indicate, on the other hand, that it wasn't that he had a necklace with this big bling, with this big avodah zarah, but rather he himself was worshipped. That's what the Gemara here on Megillah seems to indicate. But what we are told here, you're not mishtachave, you're not supposed to mishtachave to a person that's nevot kahamon. And on the most basic reading, you know what we're being told here? That you should know that the Jews, violated Avodah Zarah by bowing to Haman. Now, was bowing to Haman something that they really believed in? No, it was clearly meira. And what is the Torah? The Gemara is using it, the Bryce is using it as an example of a violation, even though it was meira. So this seems to be what Abaye claims, that a person, that even if it's an Avodah Zarah meira, it's a complete violation. Okay, Haman meira havenevad, and nevertheless it is mentioned here as a complete Avodah Zarah. So how's Rava going to defend himself? Well, Rava says, no, sometimes an example does not mean that it's there with all the details of the example. All the Bryce is telling us that, listen, if it's a person that's worshipped, don't bow down kehaman. Meaning, if you want to know an example of someone that was basically worshipped in a specific society, Haman would be an example. But that's not to mean that the Jews who bowed to him violated it, because obviously that was meira. Virava kehaman. Yeah, the example is Haman as a person, velo kehaman, but it's not a complete example. Kehamon the iu gufei avodas kachavim. Yeah, he's the example of a person that's an avodas kachavim, where the Torah is warning us that yes, you could bow to a person if it's a way of showing honor, but don't do it if it's a nevad. And a perfect example of a person who becomes like an avodah zarah was Haman, but like a Haman, but the example is not true regarding all details. Di'ilu Haman, when Klal Yisrael Nebuch had to worship Haman, was meira v'hacha, but here when that Brisa tells us that it's a violation, lav meira. So Abaye is working very, very hard to try to find proof that even if you do something me'av or me'ira, it's a complete violation. So here is his next proof. Omer Abaye mina, I can prove it from the Tanya. So to understand the next proof, a brief introduction. We know that if there are many circumstances where people have to bring karbonos for violating the law unintentionally b'shaygeg. Okay? That we're familiar with. Now, there are differences if it is an individual, if it is a Kohen Gadol, if it's a Melech, if it's a Kohen Moshe. There are a lot of details that relate, but what you have to keep in mind is the following. There are situations that the specific korban that is brought, and it fluctuates as well, from the he-goat to the she-goat to the bull, or if it's Avodah Zarah and it's a community, it's also the bull and also the goat. There is a difference because some of them, the violation of doing something unintentional is only with a he'elem davar, okay, he'elem davar, and one of them is a shigigos maise. So two words we have to be mindful of to appreciate the message here. Shigigos maise he'elem davar, okay? Shigigos maise means an action that was done unintentionally. So if a person at home, on his table, there is a piece of fat, and he thinks that it's regular shuman, and he eats it, and it's chelev, shigigos maise, okay? Shigigat maase. Now, then there's something called he'elem davar, when the matter itself was concealed from you, which indicates that there was some kind of intellectual mistake, that you, in other words, that you had a question, a halakhic question. You're a scholar, you go through all, the poskim, and you come to a conclusion, but you made the wrong decision, and then you acted. So in such a situation where you did all the research in the world, and you're a great Talmid Chacham, and you made a mistake intellectually, and then you act, there you have a he'elem davar with a shigigos maise, okay? Now, for the communal korbanos that are brought, if the Sanhedrin make a mistake, obviously there you have to have first the he'elem davar and shigigos maise. Now, what about a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen Mashiach? We call it Kohen Mashiach because we're dealing here with the Kohen on a higher level status during the First Temple period when he became a Kohen Gadol, when he was anointed with the oil that was concealed later. So that's the word. Kohen Mashiach is basically a Kohen Gadol. So here we go. Detanya. Kohen Mashiach be'avodas kachavim. Okay, so you over avodas kachavim, which the korbanos are more severe, right? Rabbi says that all that has to go wrong for him to have to bring that unique korban, the bull of the par helam dover of the Kohen Mashiach, all that has to go wrong is shigigos maise action. Chachomim say, no, that's not enough. You need also a helem dover. Okay? That's their disagreement. Now, although they disagree there, Vishavin shebeseira kiyachid, they do agree that if that if this kohen gadol violates something that's not avodah zarah, he brings the seira, the goat or the she goat. Vishavin, and so too they agree she'en mevi asham toli, that asham toli is not brought. Okay. Now, what's relevant for us is we mention here a shigigos ma'aseh. What are we mentioning here? In action that was done by mistake regarding avodas kachavim. How do you make a mistake with avodas kachavim? In other words, when it comes to a product, I made a mistake. I thought it's something else. What exactly is a mistake with avodas kachavim? Hey chidami, what's the scenario? So if he sees a shul, and he thought, in other words, he thought it's a shul. In other words, kasovar. He goes ahead, he walks by this magnificent structure, and he said, wow, this is such a beautiful shul. He starts worshiping. Next thing he knows is that the whole house is mamash avodah zarah. You cannot say that that's a shigos ma'aseh, because what's in his heart? Who is he bowing to? We don't worship shuls, by the way, right? Even the most beautiful shul in the world, we're worshiping the Rabbanu Shalom. Hare libo l'shamayim. So obviously that cannot be a case of the shigigas ma'aseh. Ella, it must be the choza andarta. He saw some kind of statue of the king, right? Vishtachavelo, and he bowed to it. Now, that also is problematic. If you really accepted it as an entity to be worshipped, it's not a shogeg, mezidu. And if you did not accept this entity, it's gornish laklumi. So therefore, Abaye argues that the only scenario could be possible, elalav, here we go, it must be avo and yira, it avo me'ira. In other words, he made the mistake, right? He was oived avodas kachavim from a love or of a fear of man, and he thought, so what would be the mistake? He thought that it's permissible, and therefore that would be a scenario that it is a shogeg. So if it would be mezid, that would be the real avodah zarah. Hey, Abaye has proof. Okay, it's talking about a person says, he thought it's permissible. Wait a second, that's a helam dovar. So the answer is that the Gemara is going to answer that something that is in tomorrow's daf, that Rav is going to tell us that there's a difference between oimer mutar legamre and a person who thought that some things are permissible and some things are prohibited. But that will leave for daf samach beis. Thank you for joining us. Everyone have a wonderful day, and we should go to it.